Thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful conference. It's been great so far. I'm going to talk about a different part of the organ transplantation system than what Typhoon talked about. There's been great work on kidney exchange, and it's a huge achievement of market designers to make this type of institution work. But there's a different part of the organ transplantation system that relates to deceased donors that this room has not contributed to as much about. And I want to potentially impress upon you that it's an important problem and to present some of the market design issues. And as Typhoon mentioned early on, there's a lot of changes happening in the deceased donor organ allocation system. There's UNOS being reevaluated, and the structure of that contract is being considered because there are lots of potential inefficiencies there. And also there are changes afoot in terms of the allocation process itself. So there are a few sobering facts that should really impress upon you that there's a severe shortage of organs in the United States. There are over 100,000 patients that are currently waiting for a life-saving transplant. And every year, so far at least, that I've seen in the last at least 20 years, waitlist additions has outstripped organ supply. In 2022, over 62,000 patients were added to the waiting list, and there were only about 23,000 transplants through all sources. So there are thousands of patients that are dying while waiting, while thousands others are being removed because they're too sick to transplant. And deceased donor organs happens to be the largest source of supply for transplantable organs. Kidneys and livers aside, there are many types of organs that we require, like hearts, lungs, and other parts that we can only get from deceased donors. And this is all happening where you have this huge organ shortage, and at the same time, about 20% or more of kidneys that are recovered for transplantation are discarded every year. So we don't find a suitable donor. There are other inefficiencies that I'm sure Jennifer's going to talk about as well. But this is a huge problem that we could potentially make a dent on. And there's been relatively little research on. I'm going to get into a little bit of the detail of how this process works, just to give you a sense of the different components of the problem, and also to impress upon you that there are lots of different players that have many different types of incentives. So the organ placement, the deceased donor organ placement process really begins from the organ procurement end. There's an organ procurement organization that interfaces with hospitals, and they are potentially going to be referred deceased donor organs, and then they have the option to potentially recover them. Now, each of these organ procurement organizations happens to be a monopoly in their local area, and there are reasons to think about why they may not be performing well. They have lots of discretion in terms of which organs to pursue, which donors to pursue, and there are lots of incentives potentially out there. There are some changes that have been previously made that I will refer to, and some research that's being done, but this part of it is a huge portion that can affect the supply of organs. Okay. In addition to, of course, work that has been done by Mario Massis and colleagues in Al Roth and Judd Kessler on expanding the number of people like you and me who register on the deceased donor list. That's one way in which we can expand the supply, but another way in which we can expand supply is think about the incentives on organ procurement organization. There are some parts of the problem that are not potentially the purview of economists. For example, organ recovery is maybe not something that we should we have the comparative expertise on, or the transplantation of organs to the transplant center. There are some logistical issues as well, but they can interact in interesting ways with the rest of the problem. So it's important to keep them in mind. The part of the problem that we have mostly focused on so far, as in the last 20 years, perhaps, is the organ matching and placement part of it, right? So here's our little brains thinking about the right mechanism to use for organ placement. This is you can think of as waitlist design problems, where there's a waiting list of patients and they must be prioritized in some way, and you need to give them incentives to accept the right set of organs, okay, so that we get good matches and we get good utilization. And so there's work by there's a lot of theoretical work on this, starting from Su and Zenios in 2004, Block and Cantala in 2017, and Jacob Leschnow's job market paper that's published in 2022, that thinks about various types of environments in which you can think about waitlist design. And one lesson that has come out of this theory is that the particular details of how things work matter a lot. So if everybody agrees on what's a good organ versus what's a bad organ, and the ranking is identical, that's the case analyzed in Su and Xenios, then the only thing that you care about is placing the organs, and you want to minimize discards. So you want to give agents strong incentives to accept something, and a last come first serve type of mechanism works well. On the other hand, if there's heterogeneity, so that the organ that I care about is not the same as the one that fits well for you, then you might want some degree of selectivity so that we are not too permissive and we don't take anything that's offered to us. We use our match values and we maximize that as well. Okay, so depending on the primitives of the market and the organs that are considered, and you can think about these as very different organs, right? So like a kidney is very different from a liver because you can wait much longer on dialysis when you have, it's not pleasant, but you can wait a little bit longer than with a dysfunctional liver or a dysfunctional heart. So in these contexts, the data that is generated from these mechanisms can be used to identify and remedy market failures. We can really try to understand how, what are the payoffs or what are the benefits, life year benefits of various types of matches, and perhaps we can design systems that, or at least simulate the outcomes of systems that take that kind of heterogeneity into account. In addition to thinking about the organ matching and placement problem, the data that's potentially generated from this system, which is administrative data on to some extent on all the organs that are placed in the United States and what happened with the patients that came from it, you can also learn about organ procurement as well as the treatment transplant follow-up work, which we'll talk about. So I'm going to give you 3 examples on how data in this type of setting can be utilized and has been utilized. I'll draw on some of my own work and my collaborators' work in these spaces to think about the different types of problems that we can analyze with data. And I'll try to keep it at a fairly high level. The first example I've already started hinting at is the design of organ allocation policy. So there's a priority rule that is specific to the patient and donor characteristics. And when Typhoon mentioned that there's a continuous distribution rule, these priority rules used to be quite coarse with some waiting time points, et cetera, prior to this change in livers. And now it's a much more continuous rule. So you can think of it as a scoring rule that scores what types of matches perhaps are better than others. At the same time, based on the priority rule, the agents are going to have some incentives to either accept or decline an organ, because if you decline an organ, you might get the next one. So that turns into a rust problem, to refer to something else that was said earlier, a dynamic choice where you can think about which kidney to accept or which organ to accept. And we want to design this so that we make the maximal use of the organs, match them well, reduce discards, but also care about fairness and efficiency, fairness and equity. We want to think about distributional across ethnicities and races, across geographies, and across the age distribution, perhaps. These are things that the policymakers in this space really care about, right? So having a very tightly calibrated model that can take all of these things into account can potentially allow us to simulate the effects of counterfactual organ allocation rules. And there are a number of them that have now been developed, starting from simulation modules from KP-SAM and LSAM for kidneys and livers. Myself and my collaborators, Ita Eshlagi and Paulo Someni are in the room, and Dan Waldinger as well, and our transplant surgeon, Michael Reese. We developed a improvement on that takes into account the fact that people's decisions might change if you change the organ allocation system. This is something that the prior simulation methods did not take into account. And this type of approach has been modified and adapted to take into account other kinds of incentives. For example, incentives to try to appear more urgent than you are, potentially, those kinds of gaming incentives that people have thought about in liver allocation. So the data from these mechanisms can potentially be used to fine-tune these simulation methods to really think about what are the effects of proposed policy design. And in that way, we can affect and potentially inform policy design. And the potential gains that we find in these papers are fairly large. A second way in which we economists can contribute using data is by thinking about the downstream effects of organ policy. And potentially Parag, Pathak is going to talk about the use of data in school choice systems to estimate the value added of going to a school. Similar issue shows up in organ allocation. It's considered unethical to randomly assign kidneys to different patients. Those kinds of randomized control trials, which are the gold standard in the medical community, are not feasible in this case. But it turns out that by just looking at randomly, perhaps by chance, I get an offer for an organ that you don't because of when we registered. Perhaps you registered slightly before me. We can extract quasi-experiments that will change who gets what organ. And when we see who's what the survival effects of that are, we can estimate the life years from transplantation. Okay, and there is scope potentially for selection here because people are accepting and rejecting organs. Okay, so those are two ways in which we can think about data in this context. Now, these two ways are fairly well understood within the market design community, but there are other types of uses of data as well. One important example, going back to the first step of the process, is measurement and benchmarking. So I told you that the organ procurement organizations have lots of discretion, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure, in terms of which donors to pursue. Okay, and there is wide variation in their performance, their measured performance. If you look at it as a fraction of the eligible donors that are eligible to transplant and how many donors are actually extracted, there is some OPOs are at the level of 1/6 of potential donors and others are at almost half. And there's this great data set that Jennifer has been instrumental in putting together that you can access, and you can see that there's wide variation in this type of performance metrics. You might think that potentially these OPOs are a bit different from each other, so there could be some variation, but it is very hard to explain the type of variation that we do see. So there's something that potentially is wrong. In 2021, there was a rule that established performance benchmarks based on a simple tier system on these very simple metrics, donation rates and transplantation rates that scores OPOs. And there's a stick here potentially, which is that if you perform very poorly, then you might be decertified. Okay, and now if you think about that, that should bring to your mind models of yardstick competition, whereby what you have to think about is what is the right metric in order to think of to score organ procurement organizations. They are going to complain that my OPO is different from yours, and so we should use different rules. And so what you want to really assess is what are the really likely transplantable donors and find ways of targeting that much better, and potentially also finding opportunities. So there's a student, Hamad Adam, at MIT, who's co-advised by me and Marzeh Gashemi, who has received this amazing data set from a handful of OPOs that have tried to take on a transparency objective and they've given them data that very few people have access to, that tracks the hospital referrals of potential donors all the way to transplantation. And so this data Hamad is using for two different types of objectives. The first objective is to try and think about how to design a better incentive mechanism that targets the right metrics, the right metrics for organ procurement. If a donor was potentially looked like they could be transplantable, but they're not, for example, because of other comorbidities, these metrics are based on only age and the primary cause of death, for example. There might be comorbidities that make them difficult to transplant. Then we can potentially get better targeted incentive schemes. Think about tuning the parameters of the yardstick competition. You don't want people to fall too far behind and while having an incentive to catch up. But more than just designing incentives, I think that there is a lot of role for using these data sets to design assistance. Ben Handel and Fanny Zeng talked about AI in healthcare. And you can think about these large data sets as trying to improve their predictions of which donors are likely to be transplantable. One possibility is that the transplant organizations, some people within these transplant organizations at least, have the best of intentions. Okay, maybe the best performing ones, or maybe not necessarily the best performing ones. Okay, so if you're incompetent, I don't necessarily blame you, but if you're mischievous or you're Machiavellian, that's something that I want to go after. So if you're somewhat incompetent because you don't really know which donors are likely to be transplantable and what are the utility of these extracting these donors, you might be able to use these data to develop tools that can help them do better. So there's a dual objective that Hamad is engaging in. And I think that this use of data can be more broadly applicable. I motivated this talk initially by pointing out that about 20% of kidneys that were recovered for transplantation are discarded. And you might wonder, why are they discarded? One potential reason why they're discarded is that the offer process is sequential. So what happens is that if once an organ is made available, I, as the placement director, can go and approach a set of patients or a set of transplant centers and suggest that this organ is available, and would you be interested in accepting it? All right. I sometimes have to wait. I often have to wait for a response, because otherwise I'll be spamming people and maybe losing their attention. So I have to wait for a little while to get their response. And then once I get their response, I can approach the next set of patients or transplant centers. This is all while potentially the transplantable organ has been sitting on ice and it's been degrading in quality. At some point, when I approach you, maybe 12 to 20 hours into the process, Itai, Paulo, and I spent a night at one of the OPOs in New England. Some transplant centers might say that this organ has been sitting on ice for too long, and therefore I do not want to accept it anymore. So in order to address this issue, there is some discretion that this OPO staff has, which is to expedite an organ that they think is at risk of discard by bypassing a certain set of donors, a certain set of patients, and going to something lower down in the list. By doing so, you've given some patient an incentive to accept an organ that is marginal, because now their waiting time is much lower. Okay, but it is done right now in an ad hoc fashion. They don't know necessarily whether this organ is at risk of discard, and they do not also know which transplant centers are likely to accept them. So one idea that we are working on, that's funded by the Kidney Transplant Committee collaboration with Itai Ashlag and Paulo Somani, is to use these data to identify which organs are at risk of discard early, and to identify which transplant centers have utilized these types of organs in the past before. And we're intending to we have built a recommendation system that allows them to experiment with potentially different transplant centers that they don't usually have relationships with. In our tool, we find that often Midwest transplant centers should try and target California transplant centers for a potential placement, is they don't necessarily have a very close connection there. And so identifying them is a little bit difficult for them based on the experience, but these data might allow you to do that. And so we are currently running experiments which are in pilot phases that thinks about how these tools are operating, and can this improve transplantation outcomes. So I'd like to conclude by saying a few things about data-driven market design and how it might be potentially different from mechanism design approach to market design. So these organ allocation markets, I hope you have already appreciated, are multifaceted. There are many players. They have varied incentives. And this is a complicated system in which every single piece is separate. And at a given point of time, it is very difficult to convince a complete overhaul of the system. And as Saifun mentioned, you sometimes have to work in pieces. And in doing so, iteration is unavoidable. It's something that Al also mentioned, that the world around this system might change and might evolve, and you might require iteration. And so Al has talked about putting on your engineering hat, thinking about these problems, not only how the theory of it works in the real world, but a part of engineering is also simulation and data and constant monitoring. And I would suggest that that is an important role that we should think about, this interface between theory, practice, and data. And as to the flow, in a different context, mentioned that sometimes you should put on our plumbing hats. Things are not working well, and minor fixes, like potentially recommendation systems, can make a big difference. It seems sometimes simple, but can't have a large effect. A second point that I've appreciated in thinking about these markets is that the agents that are interacting with these markets are important to think about. We cannot design every single aspect necessarily and control every single aspect of design. to some extent, we have to leave some room for flexibility. And part of the reason to leave some room for flexibility is precisely the fact that the world is going to evolve. And then we need this flexibility requires us to be to give some discretion to committees and contractors. And here I find that the Hart-Holmstrom incomplete contracts analogy is interesting to think about, because what parts of the design are left unspecified and how the agents' incentives interact with these parts of the design are important things to also consider in your design process. And I hope that I have convinced you that data is central to this endeavor, because there's simulation, evaluation, as well as recommendation. But I don't by no means mean to suggest that data can solve all problems. There's a close interplay between theory, measurement, and practice. And if you're interested more on that point, Eric Budish and I have written about that a little bit in our Handbook of Bio chapter. Thanks.